Gol D Roger didn't have to die that day. He was already the strongest man alive, a man who'd sailed to the end of the world and back, who'd seen whatever truth is buried on Laugh Tale, who had nothing left to conquer, and yet, dying from an illness no doctor could cure, he still chose to let the Marines take him. He still chose to climb onto that execution platform in Logetown and laugh in the face of the entire world. But what if he didn't? What if, even sick and running out of time, the Pirate King decided he wasn't ready to give the world that final gift? Because if Roger never surrenders, there's no execution, no last words, no spark that turns an entire generation of nobodies into legends. And Luffy, the boy who grew up idolizing a man who was inspired by that very execution, might never have a reason to leave Foosha village at all. Stay with me, because this isn't just a fun what if. This is the one decision the entire story of One Piece is quietly built on top of. Let's start with what we actually know, because it matters here more than almost anywhere else in this series. Roger wasn't captured. He surrendered. His body was already failing him. The pain got so bad near the end that even his own crew could see it, even though he never let it show in front of them. He'd already achieved everything a pirate could possibly want. So when the world government finally caught up to him, it wasn't a defeat. It was Roger making a choice with the only thing he had left, his death, and turning it into something that would outlive him. Now picture the divergence. Same illness, same failing body, same loyal crew standing beside him till the end. But this time when the Marines close in, something in him refuses. Maybe it's pride. Maybe it's simply not being ready to let go. Whatever the reason, Roger spends his final months running instead of surrendering, hiding instead of standing tall in the middle of a crowd. And that quiet human choice, completely understandable, honestly kind of relatable if you think about a man just not wanting to die in front of strangers, ends up being the most devastating thing he could have done to the world he loved. And there's something almost unbearably human about that choice, if you really sit with it. We like to imagine Roger as this larger-than-life figure, untouchable, always in control, but underneath all of that, he was still just a man staring down the end of his own life, same as anyone else would be. Maybe in this version of events, he looks at his crew, at Rayleigh, at Buggy, at Shanks, at all the people who loved him, and for a moment, just a moment, he lets himself want something small and selfish instead of something legendary. He wants more time. He wants to keep sailing a little longer, keep laughing with the people who know him best, keep being their captain instead of becoming the world's cautionary tale. And who could blame him for that? None of us really know what we'd choose if we were in his position. It's easy to romanticize going out in a blaze of glory when it's not actually your own life on the line. So here's the first question worth sitting with. Does Roger still die the same way? Almost certainly. Yes, his illness was never something hockey or strength could fix, and nothing about avoiding the Marines changes that. But how he dies changes everything that comes after. Maybe he passes quietly aboard the Oro Jackson, surrounded only by Rayleigh and the rest of his crew, the way any of us might hope to go, peacefully with the people we love. No cameras, no crowd, just his closest friends holding on to a moment the rest of the world will never know happened. And honestly, think about what that actually means for the people standing around his bed in that final moment. Rayleigh doesn't get to carry Roger's legacy out into the world the way he eventually does, quietly mentoring the next generation, showing up decades later to train Luffy himself. Instead, he carries something heavier, the memory of a captain who died in silence, whose final words were only ever meant for the handful of people in that room. Can you imagine that weight? Knowing the truth the entire world is dying to hear, and having no reason left to ever say it out loud because the moment that was supposed to force it into the open never came. And if that's how it ends, the world government actually gets exactly what they always wanted without even trying. Roger disappears, and his death means almost nothing to anyone who wasn't already on that ship. No spark, no age of pirates, just a rumor that quietly fades, the same way most fallen pirates eventually do. And that's the real tragedy hiding underneath this whole scenario. Roger choosing to protect himself, to die on his own private terms surrounded by people who loved him, accidentally becomes the thing that erases his impact on the entire world. Now here's where it gets personal, because Roger's execution wasn't just a historical footnote, it directly shaped the people who went on to shape Luffy. Shanks was there. He watched his captain die, laughing, unafraid, and that moment became part of who Shanks is, a man who carries Roger's belief that freedom is worth everything, which is exactly why, years later, he's willing to sit in a quiet East Blue bar, patiently waiting for the right kid to come along and inherit that same belief. Take away that execution, and does Shanks still develop that same unshakable worldview? Maybe some of it survives. He grew up around Roger's crew after all, and that kind of influence doesn't disappear overnight. But that one specific defining memory, watching Roger choose to die smiling instead of begging, that's gone. And a Shanks without that memory might still become powerful, might still eventually become a Yonko, but would he still end up spending years in Foosha village, telling stories to a little boy who reminds him of something he can't quite name? That part feels a lot less certain. And think about Buggy too, because he was standing right there beside Shanks that day. The two of them cried together watching their captain die, and that shared grief is part of why, even after everything, even after all their squabbling and rivalry, there's still a strange thread of respect between them decades later. If Roger dies quietly instead, does that shared trauma even exist? Does Buggy grow into the same jealous, chaotic, oddly lovable wildcard we know, or does he end up somewhere else entirely, never having had that one unforgettable morning that shaped the rest of his life? It's a small detail, but it's the kind of small detail this whole scenario keeps pulling on thread by thread until you realize almost nothing stays exactly the same. And then there's Garp, the Marine who spent years chasing Roger and never once managed to catch him, the two of them building a strange mutual respect across enemy lines that eventually led to Garp being one of the very few people Roger trusted with the people he loved. If Roger spends his final months running and hiding instead of standing his ground, does that relationship even get the chance to form the same way? Does Garp still end up as someone Roger's world quietly leans on to watch over the next generation? Follow that thread far enough, and you start to realize the found family structure that eventually surrounds Luffy, Garp, Shanks, even Ace's connection to all of it is resting on a foundation built the day Roger chose to die in public instead of alone. Let's zoom out further to the people actually orchestrating this from the shadows, the world government and the Five Elders. Their entire plan with Roger's execution was to make an example out of him, proof that even the strongest pirate alive could be caught and killed, a warning meant to keep everyone else in line. It backfired completely and lit the fuse on the Age of Pirates instead. So what happens if that plan never even gets carried out? If Roger simply disappears, dies quietly, away from the public eye, the world government doesn't get their cautionary tale, but they also don't get the disaster that followed it. No wave of new pirates chasing his legacy. No Whitebeard standing in the middle of the sea, declaring an entire era in Roger's name just to spite them. And that part hurts more than people realize because Whitebeard and Roger weren't just rivals. There was real respect there, maybe even something close to friendship, two of the strongest men alive who understood each other in a way almost nobody else could. When Whitebeard declares the Age of Pirates has begun, he's not just making a political statement, he's honoring a man he cared about, turning grief into a roar the entire world can hear. Take away the execution, and Whitebeard never gets that moment either. He just quietly loses an old rival to an illness nobody ever announces, mourning in private the same way Rayleigh does, with no stage, no crowd, no way to turn his sadness into something the whole world remembers. In a strange, almost uncomfortable way, the world government's failure to make an example of him publicly might actually work out in their favor. Fewer dreamers, fewer new threats, a quieter world. But quiet was never the same thing as safe because the knowledge Roger carried, the truth about the Void Century, the location of Laugh-Tale, everything he pieced together on that final voyage, none of that disappears just because there's no execution. If anything, without his final words forcing it out into the open for the entire world to hear at once, that knowledge becomes something far more unstable. Floating around unclaimed, whispered between old crew members instead of declared to every corner of the map simultaneously. And that's a very different kind of danger, the kind that spreads slowly through rumor instead of exploding all at once through headline. There's also a quieter, colder side to this that's worth sitting with. What happens inside the Marines themselves? Sengoku and Garp were both there historically for Roger's story in different ways. Men who built their entire careers around the idea of maintaining order against the greatest threat the seas had ever seen. If Roger never surrenders, if he simply vanishes into the fog instead of standing tall in front of the world, does that chapter of Marine history even get written the same way? Does Sengoku ever get his defining moment of standing over the body of the man he spent his life chasing? Or does he carry around an open wound instead? A mystery that never resolves, a rival who just disappears one day and leaves him with nothing but silence and unanswered questions for the rest of his career? Because that's its own kind of quiet tragedy too. Not every ending needs fireworks to hurt. This is the part I think people miss most when they imagine this scenario. So let's slow down here for a second. Roger's final words, that his treasure treasure was out there for anyone brave enough to find it, weren't just a taunt thrown at the Marines. They were a challenge handed to the entire world at the exact same moment, and that simultaneity is what actually mattered. Every pirate everywhere heard the same thing at the same time. And that's what created an entire generation racing toward the same horizon together. Take away the execution, and that moment of unity never happens. Instead, knowledge of what Roger found trickles out unevenly over years. Maybe Rayleigh tells a few people he trusts. Maybe fragments leak out slowly. Maybe most of it simply dies quietly with the people who knew it. And instead of one unified age of pirates exploding into existence overnight, you'd get something messier and slower. Smaller crews chasing half-truths instead of an entire world chasing one shared dream. And here's the part that actually unsettles me the most. A fragmented world without that unifying spark might end up being more dangerous in the long run, not less, because there's no shared finish line anymore. Nothing keeping ambition pointed in one direction. No laugh tale as the thing everyone's racing toward together. Just scattered, directionless chaos with no captain strong enough or beloved enough to eventually stand up and hold that chaos together the way Whitebeard does in the story we actually know. There's one more piece of this that I think deserves its own moment because it's easy to forget just how much of Luffy's own strength later in the story comes directly from people who were shaped by that execution. Rayleigh doesn't just mourn Roger quietly in this alternate world. He loses the entire reason he eventually steps back into the spotlight. In the story we know, Rayleigh spends years in hiding, letting the legend of Roger's death do its work on the world, only reappearing when a boy wearing a familiar straw hat washes up needing training before Sabaody. That entire arc, the 2 years that turned Luffy from a promising rookie into someone genuinely capable of reaching the new world, exists because Rayleigh recognizes something of his old captain in this kid, because the straw hat itself is a direct thread back to that execution and everything it set in motion. Pull the execution out of the equation, and even if by some strange twist of fate, Luffy still becomes a pirate, still somehow ends up with a straw hat, still somehow crosses paths with Rayleigh, does that old man still see the same thing in him? Does he still feel that same pull to pass on everything he knows? Or is that connection just a little bit weaker, missing the emotional through line that made it feel inevitable in the first place? Small details like this are what make this whole scenario so much heavier than it first seems. It's never just one domino falling, it's every single domino standing a little closer to the edge, waiting for a push that might never come. Now let's return to the promise I made you at the start, that Luffy might never even leave Foosha Village. Here's why that's not just a dramatic line, but something that actually holds up if you follow the story closely. Luffy's entire dream exists because of a very specific chain of cause and effect. Roger's execution inspires an entire generation. That generation includes Shanks. Shanks ends up spending years in a quiet East Blue village because of the man that execution helped shape him into, and Luffy grows up watching him, idolizing him, until one reckless, thoughtless moment as a child changes his life forever. Break that first link, and you're not just weakening the chain, you're risking it never forming at all. Without a unified age of pirates exploding across the world overnight, does a random Yonko-level crew even have a reason to dock in a sleepy little village on the edge of the East Blue? Maybe not. Maybe Shanks is somewhere else entirely, chasing fragments of a legacy that never got the chance to fully take shape. And without him there to hand a small boy his precious straw hat, without that Sea King attack, without an arm sacrificed as undeniable proof that this stranger meant every word he ever said, does young Luffy ever develop that specific burning need to sail out and become something more? Or does he grow up in a quieter, softer version of the world, one where the sea never quite calls to him the same way, where he becomes just another kid in a village nobody ever talks about, with a dream that never gets the chance to catch fire? That's the real weight sitting underneath Roger's choice. It was never really about the fight or the power or even the treasure. It was about a dying man deciding in his very last act to give the entire world something to believe in instead of keeping his final moments only for himself. That's an incredibly selfless thing to do if you actually stop and think about it. Most people, faced with the end, would want exactly what our alternate Roger chooses: comfort, privacy, the people who love them close by. Nobody would blame him for wanting that. And if he'd chosen differently, chosen comfort, privacy, the people who loved him most, all completely human things to want, the story we know, the one built entirely on a boy chasing a legend created by one man's final defiant smile, might simply never have begun. Somewhere out there, in this version of the world, a boy in Foosha Village grows up and never once looks at the horizon the same way. never feels that pull toward the sea that defines everything he becomes in the story we love. And honestly, that might be the saddest part of this entire what if. Not the world falling apart, not the chaos or the danger or the fragmented scramble for power. Just one quiet kid in one quiet village who never gets the chance to become who he was always supposed to be. So tell me honestly, do you think the Age of Pirates still happens without that moment? Or does the whole story just quietly never start? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, so drop your theory in the comments below.